The year is 1792. The first cornerstone of the White House was laid at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. The French Revolution was cranking into gear. Denmark became the first nation to ban the transatlantic slave trade. Joseph Haydn performed his 94th Symphony in G in London. And Gustav III of Sweden was getting dressed. He donned silk pantaloons and a linen shirt. He slipped on a silk belt and jacket, resplendent, of course, with decorations that included a cape, an ostrich feather hat, and a wax masquerade mask. He exited his carriage, slipped on his mask, and took his last steps on Swedish soil as he entered the Royal Opera House. And so starts another episode of Crowned, Gilded, and Screwed. I'm your host, Cara May Adamo. If you haven't been here before, welcome aboard. The format of the show is simple. We take a privileged person in history, be they royal, or as I sometimes like to call royal adjacent person, gold-gilded in some capacity, someone born with a silver spoon in their mouth, or at least acquire one early, and then they choke on it. Somehow they are either unlucky or they're screwed over, crazy shit happens to them, and then we talk about it, basically. So grab a drink, take out your opera glasses, and let the ushers guide you to your seat, because today we are discussing King Gustav III, Sweden's theater king. Prologue. Setting the stage. So, per our usual, let's take a look at the world that Gustav lived in and what brought him to the Royal Opera House on the night of March 16th, 1792. And to do that, we're going to go back even further before he or even his father took the Swedish throne. You see, 1700s Sweden looked a little different than it does today. It actually was a pretty serious military power comprising territories all throughout the Baltic Sea. It had a large army, and it had conquered a ton of land through a series of wars. Now, unfortunately, Charles XII, who was the king at the time, wasn't really satisfied with just this. He waged war on Russia in 1708, never a great idea, and in a rather ambitious attempt to conquer more land, unfortunately ends up fucking it up. It ends up being a giant-ass failure, and in 1709, Fort Chuck loses the battles, and Sweden loses much of its power. Now, what does this have to do with Gustav III, since it happened nearly 4 decades before he was even born? Well, here's the thing. Sweden wasn't an absolute monarchy. They were more like the UK is now in that they had a parliament that either works in conjunction or sometimes even in spite of whoever the king or queen may be. This parliament was called the Riksdag, and let me tell you, they were pissed. They were pissed off at Charles because of his failure of a war. They were pissed that they didn't really feel like they had enough say in the choice to do so. So when Charles dies 10 years later, they decide to do something about it. And they band together and relegate most of the power that was previously belonged to the king. They delegated that onto themselves, forming a sort of quasi-democratic parliament made up mostly, let's face it, of like rich upper-class landowners. Brazenly, they called this period the Age of Liberty. And by that, I mean, of course, the liberty to do whatever the fuck they wanted. Essentially, it was like an oligarchical government under the guise of like a constitutional monarchy. For the next several decades, they proceed to make sure that every king that was put quote unquote in charge more or less fell in line and did what they said. Now in 1719, a political party called the Hats was established in Sweden. And like a hat that you wear on your head. The Hats were a conservative group. They made up the Swedish elites at the time. So politicians, military officers, upper-class gentlemen, and of course it was men because women typically were background characters in politics, per the usual. But they were not the only political power in town. There was also the Caps. Again, like a cap on your head, there was a little bit of a theme. Basically, the Caps were everything that the Hats weren't. They were blue collar. The Hats called them the Caps to kind of be shitty. It was meant to be diminutive, like they were the Hats, and a cap, I guess, was like a little less formal. It's clever. But anyway, these two groups basically hate each other, per the usual, throughout history. For our US viewers, basically, think of the Hats as like the Republicans and the Caps as the Democrats. And honestly, you can actually take that comparison pretty much as far as you feel to. You know, history tends to repeat itself, and the Swedish government was basically in the throes of that kind of a situation. So it's a dual-party citizenship and dual-party system. You have the blue-collar workers on one side, you've got the more rich elites, landowners on the other, and all of them are trying to control a puppet king for basically 40 years, leading up until our story begins. So that's a general idea of the political system in Sweden and where it was headed during Gustav's life. Act 1. Snuff boxes and coups. Now, Gustav's dad was named Adolf Frederick. He was born into German nobility in 1710. He would have been about 9 years old when those two political parties were established and formed and kind of start to gain ground. By the time he was an adult, though, they would have been well aware of each other, and he would have probably seen it as kind of a normal aspect of, his role. Adolf Frederick may have been born a noble, but it was doubtful that he actually expected to be king. And the reason for that is he was not a direct descendant of Frederick in the first place, and he was actually what was considered a prince bishop. So when he was 17, not only was he in charge of a principality, but he was also considered a bishop in the church. So he was essentially like overemployed. For the chunk of his life, that's actually pretty much how he lived. For funsies, he did like to make snuff boxes, which, if you don't know what a snuff box is, it's a special little box that you keep your powdered, say, tobacco and other handy powders. That's where you might keep them. He liked to make custom ones. His grip on the throne was tenuous at best. He was the king's great nephew, so not a direct heir by any means. So imagine his surprise when in 1751, King Frederick of Sweden dies without an heir, and everyone decides to make Adolf Frederick the next king. Honestly, I actually think it makes quite a lot of sense from the Reichstag's point of view. He was generally knowledgeable about politics, but for the most part, he liked to be hands-off because he really just wanted to craft in his room. So this kind of makes the Reichstag happy, along with his Russian niece, which was Catherine the Great. Basically, the Reichstag wanted somebody they could control. Russia wanted a kind of malleable ally, like they always do. That's what Adolf Frederick kind of was. He was their little pet, their little puppet king, and they could boss him around. It's giving Sultan from Aladdin, just playing with the snuff boxes, probably force-feeding a parrot. So we have the hats and their little puppet in charge, and he ascends the throne on March 25th of 1751 and continues to fulfill his duty to be entirely unremarkable. Now, traditionally, Swedish queens were pretty much just like decorative figureheads, but Queen Lovisa Ulrika seems to have sort of missed that memo. She was very smart, she was aggressively motivated, very ambitious, and she didn't want to just sit there and look pretty next to her husband, who was, let's be honest, more or less sitting there and looking pretty. Lovisa wanted to actually do stuff, and she was crafty. Despite his relative passivity, Adolf Frederick is often credited with creating Sweden's Freedom of Press Act. At the time, this was huge, it was groundbreaking. There is a general consensus that this was actually more Lovisa's doing than it was Adolf's. He allegedly worked tirelessly behind the scenes, really pushing that legislation through and kind of working the room in all angles. So Lovisa was very diplomatic, and she was really in the thick of things. Honestly, hats off to her, pun intended. So throughout their reign, there were individual attempts at restoring power to the monarchy. Both were likely spearheaded by Lovisa, and both failed. It probably would have helped if Adolf was more into it, but to be honest, he was actually generally just okay to make snuff boxes and sort of take a back seat and let other people handle stuff. So let's talk about a couple of those attempts, because they definitely set the tone for the environment that their son Gustav III would inherit later on. The first time was known as the Coup of 1756, and it was, by many accounts, Lovisa's idea. The plan was to take power away from the Riksdag entirely and return Sweden to an absolute monarchy. So it would have been a major shift in what was currently going on, and the whole thing ended up imploding in on itself and was a giant mess, more or less because people found out about it before the plot even began. So it was a failure to launch, and Adolf Frederick actually nearly lost his entire throne as a result of this. So it took a long time for people to get over it and for things to kind of calm down. Now, during their reign, they do have a son, and his name is Gustav III. Gustav was, like his father, an incredibly artistic person, but where his father was passive by nature, Gustav had his mother's restless zest for participation. At a young age, he was very drawn to things like humanities and theater and social justice. Lovisa Ulrika hired Olaf von Dalen, which was a poet, playwright, and historiographer, to tutor her son, and this helped kind of further shape his worldview, because von Dalen was a huge proponent in the Age of Enlightenment. So he would promote things like knowledge, freedom, happiness for the masses, which was very different at the time. Gustav ate it up. He was intelligent, he was curious by nature. He didn't just read Voltaire, he sought him out personally and would ask him for advice when needed because they were contemporaries. So he was proactive the way his mother was, but he had a lot of interest in arts and the humanities the way his father did, which creates a very interesting balance for a king. In his teens, he traveled quite a bit, and he actually really started to take a look at what life was like outside of the nobility-laden echo chambers of the palaces that he grew up in. Seeing how common people actually lived, and more importantly, how national policies affected them and their quality of life, had a major impact on Gustav, and he empathized with their plights, and he really started to see through the bullshit caste systems that were upheld by other monarchs and nobles. When he was 20, Gustav married Danish princess Sophia Magdalena. Sophia was Gustav's age, and she lost her mother the same year that she was betrothed to Gustav. She was raised by an extraordinarily strict and religious grandmother, also named Sophia Magdalena, because, again, we're only allowed like 4 unique names per episode on Crowned, Gilded, and Screwed. I think we're up to maybe 2 or 3 now. But the marriage wasn't a super cozy one. To be perfectly honest, they mostly ignored each other. Basically, she was very introverted. She had a very small group of friends she spent time with, and she was relatively reserved. Gustav, on the other hand, he was a theater kid. You know, he went to parties and he loved productions and he liked the art of entertainment, and he was extroverted and by some accounts kind of rather fabulous. And the two of them didn't really match energies all that well. Like, politics aside, they really did struggle with their compatibility throughout their marriage. Act 2. Gus takes center stage. On February 12, 1771, King Adolf Frederick sat down to a very large lobster dinner with all the trimmings. Champagne, caviar, the works. He was a man with a sweet tooth, and he does apparently finish off this meal with upward of 14 semlas, which are Swedish eclairs, so imagining 14 eclairs. My man indulged in what would actually end up being his last meal on Earth. Some say that this would have been heart failure, others suggest it might have been poisoning, but either way, he was gone by morning. His son, Gustav III, is then crowned King of Sweden. Now, this is a pinnacle moment for both Gustav as well as Sweden, because remember, his dad was a passive puppet. He was more or less pulled in different directions, be it by the Riksdag, or Russia, or sometimes even Lovisa Ulrika, which was, of course, his wife. He wasn't really known for his backbone or his willpower, but Gustav has his mother's ambition, and he doesn't want to just chill at home, he wants to participate. And through his travels when he was younger, he'd acquired an empathy for common people, and he wanted to be known as someone who stood up for him. And the main way he intended to do this was by going head-to-head with the Riksdag. In 1772, so less than a year after getting crowned, he stages a bloodless coup. At a critical moment during the proceedings at the House of Nobles, Gustav barges in, he physically seizes a chairman's gavel, he pushes through his proposals without a vote. It's very authoritarian, even possibly with the best of intentions. Basically, Gustav III eventually succeeds where his parents once failed, and he is able to establish a new constitution that increases his powers and lessens those of the Riksdag. He does start to make some social reforms. He abolishes the old privileges of the nobility, and for the first time in Sweden's history, positions of power became available to people in more of the middle class instead of only the upper class. He was inspired by the Enlightenment, laws that were designed to help the poor so that peasants could have more rights and kind of a stronger position in society. And he also abolished torture and encouraged religious freedom. So this is very cutting edge at the time. He continues to reform Swedish society and starts calling himself a revolutionary, and he kind of was. Keep in mind, this is around the same time that the Revolutionary War is kicking into gear in the United States. He was kind of the Bernie Sanders of his day, and like Sanders, some were not feeling the burn. The common folk, though, did love him, at least until he attempted to ban farmers from distilling alcohol, which never goes well in history, but I digress. Gustav III started making waves, and by that I mean he was also making enemies. It definitely didn't help that people were talking shit behind his back, though. Gustav was known, again, to be a little bit more flamboyant. His sexuality was often questioned at a time where it was definitely risky to be questioned. His incompatibility with Sophia Magdalena did not help things. It took a while for them to conceive. Then when Sophia finally does give birth to a healthy baby boy in 1775, Gustav's own mother, Larissa Ulrika, starts talking shit. Like, the basis of this, I guess, had to do with Gustav's disinterest in Sophia. Again, nothing was ever verified, but there were definitely rumors going around that she and most women were not his type, we'll say. So he asked his close friend, Count Adolf Frederick Monk, to accompany the couple into the bedroom and literally, like, teach them how to fuck. I guess Monk was sort of like a player at court and came with glowing recommendations from Sophia's chambermaid. So they figured if anybody could teach them, it would be this dude who does it all the time. Monk apparently even wrote down details about that night, which, like, literotica can be hot, I guess, so I get it. His spank bank, if you will. Either way, the plan works out and Sophia Magdalena does in fact become pregnant, but that only put doubt into Larissa Ulrika's mind, and within 2 years of her grandson's birth, she starts accusing Sophia of having an affair with Monk, basically spreads rumors that the kid isn't even legitimate. Like, she's putting questions out there in people's heads about Gustav's kid's claim to the throne, like her grandson's claim to the throne, while Gustav still walks this green earth. Like, mother of the fucking year. Gustav did not tolerate that nonsense, for the record. He put an end to it and straight iced her out completely for a good 5 years. Dude went no contact until she was on her deathbed in 1782. So they did reconcile at the very end, but, like, not while she was walking around. Honestly, I can't really blame him. Kind of toxic. That same year, Sophia Magdalena does become pregnant with a second son, but he dies shortly after childbirth. And unfortunately, what mild closeness the two of them had managed to foster in that time sort of went with him, and they never really healed that rift. So they did have one heir, but no other real heirs. Throughout their reign, Gustav focused on his social progression, and Sophia Magdalena focused on building up a library and promoting charitable works. It might be fair to say that being King of Sweden was Gustav's day job, but he definitely moonlit as a playwright. He wrote and produced several of his own melodramatic and romantic plays. These were largely rooted in Swedish history, and they were very patriotic. Apparently, he actually really wanted to write tragic plays, but he felt that the Swedish language didn't really lend well to it, so instead he opted to write operas, because he thought that the music would kind of balance things out. So he was very particular about his plays, and he was definitely a perfectionist of what he deemed to be really his craft. One of his operas was Gustav Vasa, and it retells the story of Gustav Vasa, who was kind of a recognized national hero in Sweden. It is set in the early 1500s during the Swedish War of Liberation, which is kind of funny because that was a war about Sweden and Denmark, and his wifey is definitely from Denmark, and as we all know, they didn't exactly gel. My man had some balls, but he basically trolled his wife via play. I'm sure that wasn't the entire point, but because they notoriously didn't get along that great, I do wonder how she felt about it. Regardless of her lineage, he was completely committed to this thing, and by that I mean both emotionally and financially. Gustav hired a French artist to create the sets, he hired a German composer to do the music, and apparently he even ordered hundreds of real Swedish soldiers to play Danish soldiers in the show, which was probably out of scope for their normal job description. But hey, I mean, I guess maybe it was like a refreshing break from actual battle. I don't know. There's a part of me that loves it, and there's another part of me that's like, bro, they're not toy soldiers, and this isn't like a game that you're playing. But I don't know. I guess you could look at it both ways. I'd rather look at it as good for morale because it's just easily digestible that way. I wasn't there, but I can definitely see the argument against allocating like actual military officers for your own amusement. Either way, there's also an argument to be made that the whole thing was a propaganda stunt. If you look at the play, it does culminate in the Danish flag getting ripped down really dramatically, and then it is replaced with a Swedish flag. It reads like a patriotic flex, it's a political statement, and it sort of works. And it was actually received really, really well. People went on and on about the beautiful scenery, about the music, and there was a renewed sense of nationalism that came out of it. Think of the commercials back in the 1940s for World War II. It really geared them up. Gustav made history, and he essentially wrote and produced the premier 18th century box office hit. It earned him the nickname the Theater King, and he took the moniker actually pretty seriously. He went on to fund the Royal Opera, the Royal Ballet, the Royal Theatre, and the Royal Swedish Academy, which is best known for granting the Nobel Prize. This was something that he was personally impassioned by, and he felt it would uplift the culture of his community, and honestly, it did work pretty well for quite some time. This is a long one, so new outfit, new day, new drink. Cheers. Gustav may have been earning applause in opera houses and theaters throughout his kingdom, but the Riksdag was having none of this. By 1786, they began to retaliate passive-aggressively and started rejecting pretty much all of his policy suggestions left and right. Frustrated that he could not appease the Riksdag, because oligarchies really only work if people fall in line, he decided to try and focus on foreign affairs and made a giant mistake that many rulers have made pretty much over the years. He declared war on Russia. Never a good move. The whole thing was a big-ass revenge mission. Gustav basically said that he wanted to take back Finland and kind of revise some previously drawn-up treaties, and basically he decided this was the time. Now, it was a little bit smart on his part because Russia was stretched rather thin because they were in the middle of a war with Turkey, and Gustav wanted to align himself a little bit with Turkey as well. He sort of seizes this opportunity. He sneaks in behind the Riksdag's back, which at the time was against the law, and he sends 38,000 people under his brother Duke Charles's command to attack the Russian fleet in Kronstadt. They laid siege to a fortress that was actually only defended by 19,000 men, so half as many. And despite those numbers, the Russians held the fort and the Swedes were actually forced to retreat. After that, most military attacks for this war were mostly done by sea, but again, they kept being forced to withdraw. So now he's illegally gone behind the Riksdag's backs, he's attacked a foreign nation, and on top of that, it's going so badly. The war was not popular in Sweden, and many Finnish nobles start protesting themselves, and they start demanding that Gustav abdicate the throne. Several groups in Swedish society start to form together to conspire against him. Speaking of the tyrant Gustav, and they began, as if in a moment of premonition, comparing him to Julius Caesar himself. So a lot of foreshadowing there, not great for him. 112 officers mutinied, and members of the Riksdag even went so far as to write to Catherine the Great, telling her that they were sorry about what he was up to, they don't agree with it, it was an illegal war, and they would be interested in a treaty once he was, like, quote-unquote, deposed. So Gustav catches wind of this, and he freaks out, obviously. He demands absolute loyalty from the Riksdag, even though he definitely went behind their backs. But whatever, he tells them that they now have a choice. It's either him or Russia. It's very authoritarian now. He demands that they sign over absolute power to him for the sake of Sweden. And once he gets his way, he fucking backs out of the war. Basically, by August of that year, they sign a peace treaty, which amounts to, honestly, virtually nothing, except that Sweden had forced Russia to stop intervening in their politics as much as I guess they were before, but for the most part, almost nothing else is gained from this. He does return to Sweden, and at first he's greeted with cheers and large crowds, and they're kind of out of the loop for the most part, and they're just kind of happy that their loved ones are home. So at first, he's actually kind of cheered on quite a bit. They erect a statue outside of Stockholm Palace, depicting him, symbolizing him as this restorer of peace. And the people are happy with him for like a really, really small, short period of time because they feel like peace has been restored, even though it was kind of his fault that there was a war, like this war in the first place. Either way, people look around and realize it was actually a fruitless war, that it wasn't approved by a significant part of the government, and worst of all, it's taken 20,000 Swedish lives. It's cost the equivalent of 6 traditional government spending years, and everyone now is really, really pissed. He essentially manipulated everyone, and then he walked away with most of the cards, which, given the political climate throughout the world at the time, was like playing with fire. You do have to remember that the American Revolution ended 3 years before this happened, and the Americans won that one. Inspired by their success, the French began seeing the benefits of a more democratic society, and they started to want in. They were tired of their king and queen and their extravagant spending while their people were suffering. Now we have the concept of revolution and getting rid of monarchies starting to really catch fire in Europe at the time. And this is, by the way, exceedingly ironic because Louis XVI actually totally supported the American Revolution, and then its success came back to like bite him in the ass, which is like, it's just irony. Anyway, the point is, revolution's in the air at the time, it's catching on, and Gustav's little stunt with Russia really, really pissed off the Riksdag at a time where now everybody's starting to talk about overthrowing governments. On top of that, Gustav actually really supported King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He actually tried to form a coalition of countries that could help them, and one of their most famed escape attempts involved the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, who was Swedish and working on behalf of the king, and also was rumored to be Marie Antoinette's boyfriend. So it got messy, and he definitely was siding with them. More on that in the future episodes. We're actually going to do a multi-part special on Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, just because it really requires that much. And this actually feels like a good time to plug my book that I'm currently writing and is in the works. It's titled Layers of Cake, and it is actually about Marie Antoinette. So keeping you posted about that one. The point is, Gustav basically pulls his shit with Russia, tries an instant crazy power grab, and then turns around and ends the war, only to fully support a monarchy that was in the middle of being very publicly canceled. Bad decisions were made. The Swedish population was starting to notice Gustav's excessive spending and that he was aligning himself to the French king and queen at the time. And that's kind of the thing about government spending. It's the real issue that people have with unchecked carte blanche over a national coin purse. It's one thing to allocate funds toward helping the poor or towards sustainability projects or the promotion of public work that elevate your society as a whole. That's an entirely different thing to use public funds for versus backing an unfavorable government to start shit with sovereign countries for personal gain and to produce your own passion projects like his play, which yes, went over well, but still likely costed money. The issue is almost never whether money is being spent or not, it's how it's being spent. And Gustav was spending a lot and people were pissed. Once his attempt at rescuing Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette fell through and the French Revolution was really starting to hit a fever pitch, he prohibited newspapers in Sweden from reporting about what was going on in France at all. That is not exactly freedom of the press. And I don't think I have to tell any of you, any government body that starts encroaching on the press in their country already probably knows it's in trouble and knows it's up to something nefarious. Gustav knows he's in danger, and he starts to act accordingly. He used to be this extroverted guy that was really into public works, and at this point in his reign, he becomes very isolated, and he starts to scale down his friends group more and more. As he does this, word around town that he's actually secretly having orgies in Haga Castle. If anything, that's actually proof that prohibiting press doesn't really work, because even in the 18th century, those are the same bullshit rumors that the French were passing around about Marie Antoinette at the time. So they likely got them from them. Slut-shaming is a tale as old as time. It's always been a reality, unfortunately. He was, if anything, a dreamer, but he wasn't involved in orgies. Not that there's anything wrong with that. He envisioned this world in his mind that he could practically touch. But rumors are often dangerous, and especially when they serve to heighten the ire of an already angered populace. Some people wanted to go back to the way things were before the Riksdag lost all of their power, but some were pushing for more extreme measures, even the guillotine. And I will say this, most of these people were either noblemen or they were upper to middle class, and therefore people who likely stood to gain quite a bit from a revolution. Act 3. Pecklin's Posse. Now, there were several different attempts on the king's life, and several were actually made by the same group of guys. Let's call them Pecklin's Posse. Honestly, it's giving Ocean's 11. We'll start with Pecklin himself. Pecklin was a 72-year-old major general in Sweden, and he had grown up as the son of this influential politician. He was a wealthy guy, and he was very, very shrewd. Pecklin started off politically as a cap when he was young. That's mostly because they were kind of the ones on the come up at the time, so he aligned himself with them so that he could gain favor. And then, as soon as it suited him, he actually flipped the script, and he became a hat. This really pissed the Caps off, understandably, because he's a snake. They petitioned against him, and they actually successfully had him suspended from the Riksdag for 2 full years. Never to learn his lesson, he immediately decides that as soon as being a hat is no longer suiting him, he goes right back to being a cap, and he just keeps flipping back and forth because he's the Teflon kid, and I guess nothing stuck. He basically plays political games like that for 50 years, and he generally, during that time, found himself in the middle of virtually every political crisis. After the coup earlier in Gustav's reign, Pecklin actually kind of disappears for a while, for like a good 15 years. No one has to deal with him. And then he comes back like just guns blazing and hot to trot and becomes like the biggest opponent of Gustav. He essentially starts speaking out against him nonstop, and the two kind of become sworn enemies to the point where Gustav actually had Pecklin detained during his absolute monarchy little power grab he did. He found a way to keep Pecklin out of it. All this did was just make more of Pecklin's friends side with him, especially his rich friends. And it was Pecklin that ultimately selected everyone else that would be involved in the ultimate plot against Gustav III and his life. He even had a plan for after the king was gone. He'd already selected a slew of new ministers, everything. The man already had a draft constitution, so he meant business. So, who'd he pick? He was close to Count Klaus Horn as well as Count Adolf Ribbing, so he did loop them into his plans because they were buddies of him and they obviously shared some sentiments. He was also involved with Lieutenant Colonel Karl Pontus Lilliehorn, we're just gonna call him Lilliehorn, and Johann Jacob Ankerström. They all met at Pecklin's house the night before the murder to finalize their plans. Ankerström volunteered to be the one that, did the deed. He'd actually already tried 4 times. I guess at this point, Gustav was just like his white whale. But Ankerström was focused on this. He was a very wealthy guy, but he was actually kind of a failure in life. He owned several farms, but he'd lost a number of lawsuits with his neighbors, and pretty much all of them hated him. Essentially, he was given a whole lot of opportunity, but at the end of the day, what he mostly made his money on was as a loan shark. He'd lend money to people out at outrageous interest rates. And if it wasn't for that, honestly, he probably would have been penniless. He was not great at business, we'll say. Like most disenchanted men who come from money and somehow manage to make nothing of themselves, he blamed the government. He blamed Gustav for all of his issues. He blamed the economic policies, which, remember, took power from the Riksdag and actually helped focus more on helping the poor early on. So he's pissed about that. He was angry about the war with Russia, which, in fairness, so was everybody at that point. But he was a short little guy, and he was a little feisty, he was a little short king, and he apparently didn't know when to shut up. He'd been brought up on charges actually prior to all of this for insulting the king, and actually at that time, to do that was punishable by execution, which means I would not have lasted even a day in 18th century Sweden, so noted. But anyway, Ankerström was pissy. He was looking for an excuse to bust a cap, and so he borrowed pistols from Klaus Horn and pretty much just asked when and where. Act 4, Bonsoir, Bon Masque. Which brings us back to the night of March 16th, 1792, which is actually 233 years ago today, so happy death anniversary, I guess. Anyway, the night before, it snowed. All of Sweden woke up to a fresh blanket of powder. His plans that night were kind of set. He was going to have dinner with a group of friends, and then they were going to participate in a masquerade ball, which started at about 10:30 p.m. So when the time came, he got dressed. He then got into his sleigh and he made his way out to the Royal Opera House, one of his favorite places in the entire world. Now, keep in mind that by this time, Gustav knows that he has enemies. A masquerade would actually, on the surface, probably sound like kind of the best choice for a night out with his buddies, since the whole point, I guess, is anonymity, but Gus went and defeated that whole entire purpose by wearing, of all things, the Royal Order of the Seraphim star. This is an 8-pointed star that's got a blue medallion in the middle, and It's monogrammed with IHS, which stands for, and I'm going to butcher this because my Latin is not good, but Iesus Hominum Salvator, which in English would be Jesus, Savior of Mankind. This would be something that specifically he would wear. It is something that every single person in that damned building would have known exactly who he was because he has the star right on his outfit. Not that he seemed honestly to be hiding anyway, because he and his cronies entered the opera house and in like en masse, and then they immediately went to the back to this private room and had dinner and joked around, and you know, everybody kind of knew they were there, so I guess he wasn't really going for hiding. Everything was great at that point until a servant brings him a letter, and that letter was from one of the co-conspirators. Liliehorn apparently had had a sleepless night of panic. He realized the reality of what they were about to do, and my guess is this was made only worse because he actually lived next door to the opera house, so it's like right there just staring at him. And he was having second thoughts. My dude was not feeling well about it, but now he's kind of stuck because he wants to stop this thing from happening, but he also knows that all of his buddies are very powerful men with like murder on their brain. He can't really portray them and it wouldn't be safe, so he decides to write the king an anonymous letter that tells him exactly what's going to happen, which is essentially that someone at the opera house is there to kill him. Gustav takes this in stride, to the exasperation of his friend von Essen, who was there with him, who begged him to take it a lot more seriously. Gustav kind of thinks for a second, he gets up and he walks over to the theater box that overlooks this like stage where everybody would have been. And as he's looking out, he sees that there's a group of attendees that are dressed exactly the same. They are staring kind of from these white masquerade masks, and they've all got these black dominoes with like hoods, which was a popular fashion at the time in Venice, actually, for masquerades. They're all dressed identical. Gustav stares back at them for several minutes, turns around, walks over to von Essen and says, "This would have been an opportunity to shoot. Come, let us go down. The ball seems merry and bright." At that point, they all file out of their little private room and out onto the stage to join the rest of the guests. The orchestra starts in on their first minuet, and Gustav takes a full lap around the stage. He is mingling pleasantly with everybody. He's in a good mood. He's had a good afternoon. He's at the opera, masquerade, ball. He loves this moment. And Ribbing sees Gustav and makes a signal. Ankerstrom pushes through the crowd, gets super, super close to the king. He's now holding a knife in his left hand, and he's holding one of Horn's pistols in the right one. And the hammer is already cocked, and the barrel is now aimed directly at the king's back. Another co-conspirator places his hand on the king's shoulder and says, "Bonsoir, bon masque," which is French. In English, it would translate to "Good evening, beautiful mask." At that point, Ankerstrom fires the pistol. The bullet enters Gustav's back just below his like silk belt that would have been around his waist. But the problem is, because of the orchestra, the sound can barely be heard. So most people don't even notice that this has happened. Gustav does cry out, "I, je suis blessé," which is basically, I am wounded in French. He doesn't exactly fall over though, which was kind of what they thought he would do. Instead, he leans on von Essen, and they limp over to like a stone bench that actually was directly beneath the theater box that he had originally been ballsy and standing out in front of. Ankerstrom at this point is full-on panicked. Gustav is still awake, he's still talking, so which means Ankerstrom may have failed, and he can't use the knife that's in his left hand because Gustav's already walked off because he's not on the ground. He shouts out, "Fire is loose," which signals all of the other conspirators to do the same thing, so now they're all trying to shout this out, which is something they had all practiced when planning for this. But the orchestra still keeps playing. People have barely noticed any of this because, as we all know, when you're in the club, you can't hear shit. So the acoustics are all fucked, so everybody is still listening to the music. They don't know what's happening. Finally, an officer sees that something has happened, and he shouts at the top of his lungs for everyone to close the doors, to shut up, stop playing. No one's allowed in or out because the king is down and he's wounded. So all of Stockholm is closed immediately. Nobody is allowed to leave or enter the city at all. It is shut down. Captain Lindley Spar, who is the police chief at the time, is immediately called in. He starts taking names and investigating, and he finds 2 pistols and a knife on the floor. From there, it takes him less than 48 hours to find out where the pistols came from, which was Horn. Horn folds like a paper plane. He immediately gives up Pecklin and ribbing, and eventually Ankerstrom is located and apprehended as well. As for Gustav, they take him back to the palace. Swarms and crowds of people basically surround the castle, and they push past the guards and they get all the way up into the king's bedchamber. While they're all there, the king is being undressed and put to bed basically in front of everybody. By all accounts, he was actually smiling through the pain and making witty comments here and there. So the dude was a theater kid, he had dark humor as a coping mechanism. My man was basically a millennial. For days, they worked on his wound, which must have honestly been ungodly painful. At one point, the surgeon has to stick his entire arm into like his back to try and fish out the shrapnel and shit. So of course that means it only becomes infected because it's the 1700s and nobody has antibiotics or vaccines or painkillers and everything just sucks. So like I can't even imagine how painful that must have been. But he jokes the whole way through, so hats off. For nearly 2 weeks, he clings to life with everything he has. He continues to more or less govern from his deathbed, and the longer that took, the more people started to feel bad for him. Then, one day, he is slouched up in his bed, and he murmurs, "I feel sleepy, a few moments' rest would do me good," and then he was gone. Le Denouement, the aftermath. Now, aside from the 4 horsemen of Gustav's mortal apocalypse, which of course were Pecklin, Horn, Ribbing, and Ankerstrom, we now know that there were actually upwards of like 150 people that were co-conspirators and involved in some capacity that night. In fact, they actually knew this back then too, although you would never know it because things actually got really weird when Gustav died. And by weird, I mean they started to seem a little sus. We know Pecklin and his buddies were in on it, obviously. Ankerstrom straight up bragged about it. He bragged about his involvement. He had zero measurable remorse, apparently, about doing this. But when it came to issue sentences and punishments, Ankerstrom was the only one who was executed for his crimes. His crime of killing the king in the same country where he was once on trial for his life for insulting that same king. Now he's on trial among all of his buddies for co-conspiring, and yet at some point, he's the only one who got the block. So how could that happen? The answer, unfortunately, may have sat with Gustav's brother, Duke Karl. Now, Karl was friends with a lot of guys in the Reichstag, and he allegedly might have known that something was going to happen. Now, the breadth of that knowledge is a little bit up for debate. Historians generally agree that he had like a whiff that something was going on, or at least knew that Gustav was in trouble, which again, by that time, so did Gustav. But this is a little different because this particular night, for once, he forbade his wife, Elizabeth Charlotta, from even attending the ball, even though it was the last big bash of the season. Everyone was talking about it. It was the last thing you could do that was fun before Lent. And yet she wasn't allowed to go. Then when couriers showed up at Duke Karl's house to let him know that his brother was shot, even though it was well past 11 o'clock at night, my dude was sitting there just completely dressed, kind of expectantly waiting, which seemed weird. Again, circumstantial, but then it becomes even more suspicious when you look at the actual sentencing of the 4 prisoners. Now, Karl takes the initially very harsh sentences, multiple of which were at one point execution, the death penalty, and he lessens most of them. Pecklin was the brains of the entire operation, and all he got was like a life sentence in a fortress, but it was basically like a rich people prison. He ends up dying 4 years later of like natural causes, and apparently he was quite comfortable. Karl did have a list of 150 co-conspirators, and yet he halted further investigations the New York minute they snagged Ankerstrom, who again was kind of bragging that he did it. They end up making an example out of Ankerstrom, and he is the one that gets executed. And I'm going to give a trigger warning because this gets bloody. I've learned a lot about beheadings in my research over the years. There are a couple of things that kind of freak me out and give me the ick, naturally, because it's beheadings. I'm going to list a couple of them. Number 1 is allegedly, if you do it right, the person doesn't feel a thing. If it's one swift chop and it's a sharp enough knife, they're just kind of out. I don't really know how they would know that, but I'm not a scientist. I'm sure there's a reason. I'm just not pretty. The other one is that you're actually still alive for like several seconds up to a full minute after your head's chopped off. Apparently some dude suspected that this was true, and he was set for like the guillotine, and he announced to the guards and people around him that he would blink several times to prove that he was right. And sure enough, he apparently blinked 11 times before he finally died, which is commitment, and I have to respect that. But it kind of makes me question like whether you don't feel pain. I don't know how any of it works, but just know that that is apparently true. Either way, it doesn't matter for Ankerstrom because he definitely felt pain before his head was chopped off. Initially, they chopped off his right hand because that's the hand he used to kill the king. Then they chopped his head off. They then proceeded to drag out his innards and they put his head on a spike. He was dismembered and then he was buried in various places. In fairness, he did murder a king, so, you know, understandable, I guess. Or did he? Because I actually read one account that said that Gustav's wound wasn't actually considered life-threatening, and that there may have been some evidence that the sudden serious infection that took 2 weeks and eventually killed him might actually have been chemically caused by the attending surgeon on purpose. The attending surgeon was Daniel Thiel, I believe is how you pronounce his name. Apparently he really hated Gustav, and so some people thought the reason that he took a turn was that Thiel was finishing the job that Ankerstrom started, which means that Ankerstrom might have still been a failure at even this, which sort of makes my heart sing. Either way, famous medium at the time apparently predicted that Gustav would be assassinated back in 1786 when he visited her undercover, apparently. She was well connected enough, and this was a well-acknowledged event enough to where she was actually interrogated about the murder during the trial and the investigation. Duke Karl eventually continues in Gustav's stead after his brother dies. Neither he nor Sophia Magdalena, like I said, were there when he passed, but the whole family ends up in this embittered fight that culminates in a continuation of that smear campaign regarding their son's legitimacy. Because remember, they have a son that his mother, Lavissa Ulrika, questioned the legitimacy of. So they dug that back up. I'm sure her ghost was just cackling because she sounds awful. There were 2 operas later on in the centuries that were done regarding Gustav's murder by Auber as well as Verdi. I honestly don't think anything would have made him happier on this planet than to be commemorated in an opera, although I feel like murder would have been less high on his list. Either way, his contributions to the humanities and to social reform and the arts is undeniable. His reign does go down in history as the Gustavian Enlightenment, so despite his political kind of controversy, he's still really lauded for all of his work in the arts and again for social reform. We really appreciate you all for joining us. Thank you for listening. That's our show. We just started around 7 or 8 months ago, and we're honestly blown away by the response that we've had and all of the love that we've gotten from you guys. So if you'd like to follow us on the socials, you can hit us up at Crown Gilded and Screwed on Facebook. If you want to find me, just look up Cara May Adamo, spelled the way that you'll see it on the screen. You can find me on either Facebook, Instagram, or Threads. I'm pretty consistently on all 3 of those. Or if you're more of a TikTok person, you can find me on TikTok as well. My label is Karita May on that one. I'm less active on it, but I do show up occasionally. Shout out to our editor, Rosilio, and as always, to our producer, Chaz McNeese. I appreciate both of you very much. If you like this one, please like, subscribe, tell the others. It helps us continue to kind of create content and helps me with the validation I so desperately seek. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.